Cool. Okay, let us get started. Um, so before we start, I'd just like to form an acknowledgement of country. So we pay our respects to elders past and present, to the many Aboriginal people that did not make elder status, and to the Tasmanian Aboriginal community that continue to care for country. We recognize a history of truth which acknowledges the impacts of invasion and colonization upon Aboriginal people, resulting in a genocide and forcible removal from their lands. Our island is deeply unique with spectacular landscapes, with our cities and towns surrounded by bushland, wilderness, mountain ranges, and beaches. We stand for a future that profoundly respects and acknowledges Aboriginal perspectives, culture, language, and history, and a continued effort to fight for Aboriginal justice and rights, paving the way for a strong future. So thank you all for coming to our Execulen, for those of you in the room and also for those of you who are going to be watching this in the future. This is our Execulen session 1, planning and running your events. Apologies, we weren't able to run it the week before due to a number of events that we had running at the time, and a lot of us were unwell. But yeah, basically, this session is essentially a refresher for planning and running your events. If you haven't attended our Student Leaders Conference, we do a little bit more of a deep dive into this. It's actually a really big session, but we're going to try and condense this to under an hour. To try and because of the limited time, but it's basically yeah, sort of an in-depth from how to planning ahead, completing your application, and how do you get it all the way to launch, and then post-event debrief, and what are the bits and pieces that you have to look out for. But it's also a space for you to inform you, but also give you the opportunity to ask questions about our procedure if you're ever unsure about the process. It's going to be a very casual one as well, so please feel free to pop anything in chat. And Jess, if you could please also have a look through the chat, if or you can feel free to unmute and also yeah, say anything about anything that you might have about this session. So again, what do we want you to get out of this session? Well, what we want you to take away from this session is an understanding of why we have risk assessments, so why we do those things if you're not familiar with them yet. So risk assessments are basically documentations that we ask you to fill out whenever you're running an event. It's somewhat kind of like a proposal, but not really a proposal. It's more about assessing what risk factors you might have at your events, and what you need to look out for and what you need to do, what you need to in order to ensure that your events run very smoothly and also safely too. Because at the end of the day, your clubs are governed by our insurance, and so we want you to be, making sure you align to that, but also still running it in a very fun and safe way. And also learning about what risk mitigation procedures mean and why we ask you to do the things that we ask you to do. So to make it a bit more fun for now and a bit lighthearted, um, I'm gonna do a short exercise to identify the hazards in this image. So you're more than welcome to unmute or just pop it in chat. But basically, my first quiz here is to ask you to identify what can you see, what hazards can you see in this picture. Um, so yeah, I believe there's about 8 hazards in this photo. Can you identify what those are? So I'll give you about a minute. Feel free to pop it in chat or unmute. Yep, there's one chat there. Cool. Yep, open fire, drinking, food service, lack of water. Yep, large crowds. So you've identified 1, 2, 3, 4. Drinking and yep, and technically 5 because yep, there's alcohol and then there's sold out. So you've also yep. So I'll move on to the next one. So basically these are the things. So you've identified most of it really. Great job. So one of the first things you could see here is loud music. So if any of the audience is not acquainted to loud music, that could be an issue. You know, and also you've got unsuitable like thongs. You know, you've not suitable footwear. You've also got a sunburnt person. Because so you're not recommending, you know, using sunscreen, especially in a very open festival. Now, I'm not saying these are the kind of events that you'd be running, but you know, a lot of these hazards could apply to your day-to-day events. But basically, it's one of those things that are unexpected that actually you should expect because it could be dangerous. There's also, of course, you've identified lack of water. There it's sold out and no one's replaced it or no one's done anything about it, especially because you've got drinking at your events. You know, you've got someone who um, is you know essentially intoxicated at this point, had a few to drink, and there's no water. It's great that they have food, but you also need water. Food poisoning as well. Here on the left hand side here, someone's already turning green. There's also the one on the tent with a loose rope. So basically, that's a hazard right there. Someone could trip. It's a trip hazard. There's yep, open fire, which also you've identified. So yeah, there's about 8 risks in there, but also yep, the drinking aspect of it is also a risk. Like alcohol in general is a risk for events that you're gonna run, and so that's something that's on you to manage. So make sure that your event runs successfully and safely. And so this is another one as well. You know, like for example, again, and I'm not gonna say that this is the kind of event that you would typically run for a student club, but you've got ones like engineering laneway, for example, that is a huge event. The experience is something quite similar to this, but oftentimes they have risk factors that are actually I guess that you have similar ones depending on the size of the event and also the type of event. You do share the risk in there as with other smaller events. You know, assault for one is another thing that you always look out for. That regardless of the size of your event and what type you run. Weather as well, like rain, lightning. As you've seen in your risk assessments, you could either run it indoors or you just cancel it depending on how bad it gets. So question is, what exactly is good risk management? Like, what's something that you'd find just outside of your typical RA? Like, what does it actually mean? Because the reason why I ask this is because we are governed by TUSA's insurance, as you may or may not be aware. Just because you are affiliated with when it comes to being affiliated with TUSA, you do get access to our range of services and support as part of the clubs and societies. But also you are covered in general for insurance, but the way you get covered for insurance isn't limited to just being affiliated. It also means that you have to follow protocol, and that's following whatever's in your risk assessments and having good risk mitigation measures, because we cover it on a per event basis too. So just you can't just like have it approved and that's it without following these protocols, because then you could be liable for negligence or duty of neglecting your duty of care. And that's why we have to have good risk management, because of our insurance governs that basis. So you can't take half measured approaches. Like for example, with this one, if you're fixing lighting, there's a lot of risks there. You can't just put a ladder in there and have that. Or this, for example, I grabbed some of a ridiculous couple of photos, but someone is doing something dangerous, and is a chemical hazard or risk hazard, and someone's just there standing, or like chucking in ladders on the corner, which could happen depending on what kind of events you have. But basically, when you're doing risk management, you're not just there to simply tick a box. You have to meet legal obligations that are fairly straightforward. But what we're looking for is for pushing beyond what we have to do to basically what we should be doing to create the safest and most rewarding environment for our members. If you're doing something very safe, then that's good. You're gonna create something fun and worry-free. The university sets the rules for what we can and cannot do on campus. That's why if you're doing on-campus stuff, there's a lot of things here and there. And outside of that, TUSA is the governing body that sets the rules out by which clubs and societies need to comply. So if you're doing things off campus, there's other things that you need to follow, which is usually what we write in there during our daily in our communications when you're running events or for doing RAs in general. But the reason why we have this as well, and this is something that got started on as we hit the 2020s, is that TUSA has a memorandum of understanding with UTAS. So SAF is a component of our agreement to support the clubs and societies, and all the other initiatives to help you student life and basically the well-being of everyone at the university. So what is a risk? Well, these are the different kinds. It's not a it's not the full list. It's also there's a whole heap more, including but not limited to injury, illness, death, harassment, or abuse, destruction of property, financial loss, loss of data and records, membership loss, legal liability, minors or vulnerable people at events, and event agreements with licensed venues. So there are things that you have to look out for. And basically, a risk is anything that might affect the overall success of your event, because what you're gonna, and also another thing to look out for is reputation of not just your club, but also our reputation as well as the parent organization. So it's a lot of things, lots of factors that you have to look out for when you're running things. The best events usually it's fun, and it runs very safe and it's worry free. Just pack up and go. Meanwhile, mitigating all of these things. But it's important to consider all the risks involved with running and organizing your event so that you're prepared if something ever goes wrong. Like for example, you need to have a wet weather plan, like for bad weather, or what if a barbecue gas cylinder leaks, or someone trips over a power lead, or if you have children at your events, how do you deal with that? And also managing intoxication at your events as well, if you have alcohol at those. But these are just a few things that you need to consider when you plan and run your events. So yeah, and also financial loss as well. So fix ups from something going bad, that sort of stuff. So whenever you might see this in your documentation, you've got the different risks here. So our goal is to ensure the lowest residual risk rating possible. So if you're just running, say, something like very casual, like a meeting, usually it would sit around here. If anything involves, if you have events that involve alcohol or children, your residual risk rating would likely end up around the moderate one. Usually without the appropriate risk mitigation measures, it would be higher. But residual risk rating just means if there's all these risks, if you include all of these risk mitigation measures to make sure that you run your events as safe as you can, as humanly possible, what would the overall risk rating be? So if you do it at the safest way possible, then this is how, within your control at least, what risk rating would it equate to? And so when I say things like alcohol and children, for example, um, the reason they end up in the moderate risk is because there are external factors which, you might not necessarily be able to control. I mean, you could try to predict a lot of things and you can work with other people, but there's still a risk there, external risk there that might be present. And so that's why it's left there at the moderate risk. Or for our other adventure clubs like rafting or dive, there are a lot of external factors, environmental factors, which is why they sit slightly on the higher end of things, but usually quite moderate. If you got very trained people, that sits around there. So ideally, you want to sit in this area here. Um, Even if you're running very safe events, there's a chance that could go up, and so that's why you want to make sure that you follow through your RA, you follow through your procedures to make sure that's low.